Hello and welcome to RIVE Reflections in Veterinary Education. We have I don't know, a pretty special episode tonight where we're going to discuss the development, creation, and establishment of the Academy of Veterinary Educators. And we have two of the people who were instrumental in making that happen. And so I'm gonna take a little more of a back seat tonight and ask a lot more questions from Eric and Catherine. So I'm gonna turn it over. Eric, this was your idea, so why don't you take it over and talk about the plan?
Yeah, for sure. So I have two anecdotes to share with this. One is probably almost 25 years ago, I was at a conference and I got a really good piece of advice about writing case reports. And that is when you see a weird case and you're like, this might be worthwhile to write up. That night, go home and write a summary because your memory is fallible. And the longer it gets between when you saw that case and everything happened and you'd go to write it up and you're like, oh, I can't remember, all these things. And that feeds into one of the most interesting studies, I think, which is um, they looked at flashbulb memories, which are these big impactful memories that you have. So let's start with a little group task. Where were you on 9/11, Catherine?
I was in the gym at Fort Lewis, Washington on the treadmill watching the two televisions, thinking that it was a horror film because it was 6 a.m. in the morning, and then realizing that it was not actually a horror film.
Mm.
Wow, wild. Bobby?
I know where this is going, but I'm pretty sure. So I was in college on campus at Grand Valley State University, and I was walking. Like I remember walking in between buildings, going from class to class, and like people, not everybody had a smartphone, right? Like nobody had a smartphone. So but people were like talking about. I just heard murmurs and things like that, and then I got to my next class, and our professor was like, we're gonna take a minute and talk about what's going on in the world right now. So yeah, I remember being like, something is weird, and then going to class, and I couldn't tell you what class it was, but I could tell you the building. It was Lake Huron was the building. I think that's what I remember. How about you,
Wow.
Eric?
So I think so as a resident, I was in a early morning colic, one of those 3 a.m. gigs
Oh,
that was going on into the days. And we were, I think, possibly listening to the radio. I can't remember how we got the information, but their horse was on the table, I seem to recall, when we got this. And we were all like, we can't process this. We got to deal with this horse, you know?
yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, Bobby, you know where this is going. So this study is a 10-year follow-up of a study of memory for the attack of September 11, 2001, flashbulb memories and memories for flashbulb events. And so they found people 2 weeks after 9/11, asked them what they were doing, and then followed up with them up to 10 years later. And what they report after 2 weeks is not what they reported years later. But their belief in that memory was so strong. They're like, no, I definitely know. And for my parents' generation, it's like, where were you when JFK was shot? Like we have really strong belief of these memories. So all of that is a lead up to say that our memories are infallible. We don't remember things very well over time. And I relatively early on in Rive, we talked about this as a topic. And I've kind of like talked about the topics that I'm like, oh, I got to talk about this thing. And as I was looking through the list, I'm like, we should cover this. Like we should capture this information as soon as possible before it is gone.
Yeah.
So that was the impetus for this.
I like
Good.
it. So I'm gonna just share my little anecdote off of that. So my I was able to in college. I had a major biology. I minored in philosophy, and then I had an emphasis in Holocaust studies because that was a thing I could do, and I got really fascinated by it. But one of the courses that I took that wasn't like directly about the Holocaust, but it was called Trauma, Culture, and Memory, and we talked about this, and we talked about the studies where they asked students like, where about where were you in JFK, like school students, and then 1 year later asked them one like, where were you, tell us the thing. They wrote it all down, so in the kids' own writing, here's what I did, and then a year later asked them to recall and also rate how sure are you, and then went back and showed them, and they were like, no, that was like dissonant, because you're like, that looks like my writing, but that's not right. And it's amazing that the confidence somebody has in their memories is not necessarily going to correlate to the accuracy of it, which is why like eyewitness testimony and things like that is so valuable. But anyway, so that's why I was like, oh, I think I know where you're going with this. Because yeah, like even in undergrad, that was something that I had learned a lot about, and it's fascinating. And you're right, like the sooner you can document these things, the better. So I love it. Yeah, let's document things while it's still relatively fresh in everyone's minds. Great.
So as the one who was there, Catherine, do you want to start us off with your memories
of how AVE started, or
yeah? Or yeah, I guess, I mean, like the beginning of the process. So like the American College of Veterinary Medical Educators effort sorts of things start there.
So it actually, for me, what I remember was very early on having a conversation with John Descanio, who was my boss for 2 weeks before he left and went to Texas Tech. And just sort of onboarding at Lincoln Memorial University and having a conversation about some of the things I wanted to do. So I had come on as the inaugural director for their Center for Innovation in Veterinary Education and Technology, which I later found out was really more because I had the credentials to start their Master of Veterinary Education program, but that's another story. But they, so just having conversations about some of the things that I had been thinking about and what I wanted to do. And he actually mentioned to me that he had sort of thought about that potentially or something like that, but just never really got around to doing it. But it seemed like a good idea. And so that was kind of the initial early conversation. And then after he left, Dr. Stacy Anderson became my boss, and we had a conversation about it. And basically it was like, well, I mean, might as well try it, right? So that was probably a year or so, I think, into my tenure at LMU. And I basically did some research on ABVS and what the requirements were and all of those kinds of things. And part of the requirements for that were to find, at that point, I think it was 25, I would have to go back and look, but like 25 people that would be considered education experts or experts in the field based on their credentials or whatever. And so I gathered, I think, a group of 25. And I think I actually ended up with about 32. And then we had this back and forth with ABVS, and they were basically like, well, listen, we really support this idea, but we don't think you belong with ABVS because it's not a clinical specialty. Also, if you do decide to go forward with it, we're going to need, I think they had changed it to like 30 or 35 people. So there were like all these barriers that were put into place. And I'm stubborn. So I was like, fine, whatever, I'll just do the paperwork. But I think what really catalyzed it was a conversation with you, Eric. I don't remember exactly, and maybe you can fill in some of the blanks, but I remember we were having a conversation about something. I don't know if it was via email or something. And I was like, hey, and I think I had found out recently that you had like this master's of education or physical education or what sports psychology. And I was like, oh, he'd be great for this. So I said, was like, hey, I've been, dabbling around with this. Would you be interested? And Eric's response was like, yes, this is amazing. Let's do it. And so I think that was really the sort of the full catalyzing action that got us to the point where it was like, well, ABVS isn't super excited about it, but let's figure out a different way. So I don't know if you want to take it from there, but that's kind of what I remember it being.
Yeah. I remember coming on, or you reached out to me, or we chatted about it somehow after you had the organizing committee sort of and did the initial thing. And then you mentioned it to me, and I think I was part of the appeal that we submitted and got the kind of final answer back. And then, so my sort of perspective that I'm bringing for this is in certification of martial arts instructors or licensing thereof. There is no such thing, right? You need a license to be a barber. You need a license to be a physical therapist. You need a license to be a massage person. There's no licensing for martial arts instructors. Any yoho can like put out a sign, be like, I'm a black belt, come send your children to me and give me money. And who knows what happens when they're in this building. And so I spent quite a large amount of time pursuing that and be like, why is there no licensing? Like, we should be licensed. Like, we should understand that just being a black belt does not qualify you to be a teacher and own a studio. Like, you need to have qualifications. You need to know how to teach. And I was like, why can't we just make a licensing for martial arts instructors that would become the industry standard, and it's like, this is a thing that you have to do. And then I realized that I had a 60+ hour a week clinical job and couldn't make that my life's work. But I did all that like sort of background philosophical, discovery. And so when you were like, okay, well, the ABVS like said no, I'm like, let's just do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. He was just like,
So
oh,
just
so what? We can just do it anyway.
Yeah. So just to clarify for people listening who maybe don't have this, so one, ABVS is the American Board of Veterinary Specialists or Specialties.
Specialties.
And so that's kind of the overarching group who would oversee, if you wanted, like the American College of Veterinary Surgeons or of Internal Medicine. So that's kind of who oversees all of the individual specialty organizations. And so the idea at the beginning was, let's create a specialty akin to those clinical specialties where somebody would graduate from vet school and could do a residency to become a vet. That was kind of the idea of the original, and the ABVS was kind of like, yeah, maybe just talk about that a little bit more for folks.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a formal residency. So one of the
Sure.
things I had investigated, I had considered getting board certified in preventive medicine, and preventive medicine has an alternative certification process. And so does since learned, so does microbiology, and there are a couple of others that don't require you to go through a formal academic or rotating residency or whatever, or private practice residency. And so the idea was, yeah, it was very much about like becoming a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Medical Education, or, whatever, how we ended up labeling it. And just basically the idea was that, so, I mean, I don't have a quote unquote clinical specialty, like a medical clinical specialty, but I do have specialty in education. My master's degree and my PhD are in education. And I think selfishly, from my perspective, it was like, that doesn't mean I don't bring something to the field of education. And there were at that point not a lot of other people who had PhDs in education as well. And I'm not saying that a PhD automatically would have translated into being recognized as an expert or whatever, but that we had additional training or additional interest, heavy interest in education. And to me, that is a clinical specialty, right? Because and these were some of the arguments we made to the ABVS too, right? Was like, like nobody gets to be a vet unless they go to vet school. And the only people who are teaching in vet schools are vets and PhDs, right? So you kind of have to do that. But it's a profession and it's a practice, just like veterinary medicine, right? Like you go into teaching practice, you don't go into teaching perfect, just the same way as you don't go into clinical, perfect. And so those were some of the discussions and arguments, I guess, back and forth that we had. But they were I think it actually ended up working out really well that we didn't go that route for a number of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, that was the original intent. And because honestly, before I really had that interaction with Eric, it wasn't like, oh, well, we'll just do it anyway and we'll figure it out. It was just like, well, this is the route that I knew that we could potentially go, that was already recognized, that carried some weight behind it. And so that was just sort of the initial process that I went down.
Yeah, the ABVS has, clear rules for this is what it takes. These are the steps. This is the timeline, yada, yada. And so in some ways it's the path of least resistance, right? And just, oh yeah, okay, just follow their process and whatnot. And just as an aside, this kind of reminds me, there was a proposal for a college, I think of acupuncture, some years back. And they asked for public commentary as part of the process. And one of the requirements for ABVS is that you have substantial literature, basis that supports your specialty. And so that was my comment about the formation of that college. But thinking about like education, I'm like, oh man, we've got like 150 years of research.
Yeah, there's a journal dedicated just to this, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that was the part of the process. And then, ultimately when we did the open comment period, we received, to me, it was like about 50-50 for and against. And some of the comments against were, I mean, quite frankly, just kind of stupid, right? Like, what do you mean I'm already board certified in X and now I have to be board certified in Y to get a teaching job? No, that's not what we're saying at all, right? And
like, why? It's like if you're not board certified in surgery, you can't do surgery. It's like that's not what's happening.
Right. And it was so some of them were sort of stupid, and then some of them were pretty legitimate, right? Like some of them were, hey, listen, I have a PhD, but I'm not a veterinarian. And if you go through ABVS, I've been teaching in veterinary education for 20 years, but I wouldn't be able to be recognized in the same way that my veterinary peers were. And I think that really ultimately, for me at least personally, swayed me away from continuing down the road, because the letter basically said, well, we don't feel like this is appropriate for ABVS. We can't stop you from putting in a formal petition if you choose to do so. So we could have done it, I think. But in conversations with Eric and some other individuals, especially that organizing committee, we kind of came to the consensus that, you know, that education was much more expansive than veterinary medicine. And while we wanted to have veterinarians have an opportunity to achieve that recognition, we also wanted other individuals to be able to achieve that recognition, whether that was a veterinary technician or, you know, a PhD or a student who was interested that had previous, you know, training or whatever. And so that's ultimately the route we went, was just basically like, all right, well, screw it, we'll just do it on our own, because we had the American College of Theriogenologists, but they had started off as a society, and they still, from what I understand, run parallel organizations. Is that correct? So that's
which is similar to what the emergency, like, so there's the American College of Veterinary Emergency Critical Care Specialists, but then there's also VEX, which is the Veterinary Emergency Critical Care Society, which is open. And so we have technicians and we have practice managers. And so, yeah, it certainly makes for a more inclusive process, and they can be one and the same, you know, in some cases, but most of the time, like, yeah. So VEX has way more members than ACVEC does. Yeah. And so it does create some you know, different approaches to things, having that larger society, and again, can be way more inclusive, which, as you've said, Catherine, is really one of the biggest pros of going the society route versus board specialty.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of how I think that started in like 2021, I want to say, is kind of when 2020, 2021. So it's been 3 or 4 years since we really sort of had the original paperwork that was sent in. And again, we're not the first ones to think of this or have this idea. I think we were just the first ones who were like, we're going to do it.
Yeah, which counts for a lot. So, okay, so how do you just start a society?
Yeah, so we you know, we had those group of people, and then we needed to generate a membership. And so it was really people, like, word of mouth and getting people to email in and say, hey, I want to be a part of this. You know, we didn't have any dues or anything like that. It was pretty much, once you email the secretary, who was Heidi Vance at the time, your name got added to the list and you were, you know, considered a member. I don't know if you have more details, Catherine.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I remember it starting. I think too, we did kind of kick around the idea of, you know, dues and things like that, because we initially talked about doing a nonprofit, which we had planned to do, and then I don't know, I think it was because Julie Noyes was part of AAVMC at the time, and she has a PhD in educational psychology and is really committed to veterinary education. And so she kind of brokered this deal where we had a conversation with AAVMC, and she was like, you know, there's benefits to partnering with us and this, that, and the other. And so ultimately we did enter into a partnership with AAVMC with some hesitation on my part, and I think from some other people's parts as well, but it was expedient in the sense that they, you know, they allowed us to have a $60,000 budget in the very first year of our real organization, where we had like elected people and sort of started trying to come together as a real organization.
It also had infrastructure in place, right?
Yeah. Cool. And I think for me, part of it was a little overwhelming, because I remember thinking to myself, this is great. This is awesome. You know, if we get 200 people, that would be amazing. And then we would check in with Heidi every week or so, and she's like, oh, it's 350. Oh, it's 425. Oh, it's, I mean, we're up to almost, as far as I know, almost 700 people now on that listserv, which is a little bit overwhelming. And of course, not all of them are as involved as, you know, some of them, but what it also reinforced to me, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, was that there was a real niche market for this, right? There's a lot of people out there who are in veterinary education who are really interested in not only finding other people who are, you know, interested in that as well, but potentially interested in being rewarded for and recognized for their ability to be a really good educator. So yeah, and so we partnered with AAVMC and ended up getting a listserv put up, you know, and all that kind of thing. And a lot of that was through the efforts of Julie Noyes. And then, you know, that's obviously not happening now, but that's how it started. So
So then you're sitting there like, okay, we want a society. Well, what does that even mean? And how do you decide what it looks like and what the structure? So talk through like what were the conversations that were going on? You had those initial 25, 30 people that were maybe looking at the specialty organization, and then you're pivoting, opening it up to other people. So yeah, talk me through how that all happened.
So yeah, I mean, I think we had elections and sort of put in a governing structure, and we had lots of conversations about, what other organizations were out there that were sort of trying to do, that were in the same space. They weren't maybe necessarily trying to do the same thing. There, I don't think anybody we talked to was really trying to do credentialing per se. So we talked to VIEW, which is the Veterinary Educators Worldwide. We talked to AME, which is the Association of Medical Educators in Europe. We had some conversations sort of by proxy with the AOE, which is the Academy of, AOME, Academy of Medical Educators. Talked to CIVME, which is the Committee on International Veterinary Medical Education. Like we had all of these organizations that had pieces of what we were trying to do as an organization, but didn't really pull all of it together. And part of that was because we didn't want to step on anyone's toes, but we also kind of wanted to let them know what we were doing. We actually have a lot of people who are members of our organization as well as those other organizations. And in our initial conversations, we were basically told, oh, don't do it. Don't do a credentialing. We've thought about it, especially I think AOME, if I'm remembering correctly. We're like, yeah, we really tried. It just didn't work out. It's not really worth the headache for whatever reason. They never gave us really specific reasons though. I don't remember them saying because of X, Y, or Z. And so I'm still confused by that because I don't know if it was just that they didn't have the expertise or the willingness to do it or whatever. But we did get a fair bit of pushback from that. But they also said, but if you guys ended up doing it, that would be awesome. So, I mean, I will say that, they didn't tell us not to do it. They just said they tried and it didn't work out. So there was a lot of talking, I think, and coordinating across the pond and, talking about, what we were going to do and how we were going to manage that. So that's what I remember. Eric, do you have different
memories? From an organizational perspective, there were a lot of conversations about having a society, like let's just start with a society first, and like let's get all the people on board and like all of that, and then one day we can build to having a credentialing or a specialty. And I was strongly in favor of like let's do both, because we, again, like veterinary medical education has 100+ year long history. Like we don't need more time, like let's just do it. But there were definitely those conversations of like, should we be one organization, even like should we have a separate society from the credentialing body and have that separation. And it's, again, the insight from theory of genealogy that does it that way, and emergency critical care that does it that way, and ultimately settled on the organization structure that we have, which is, we're going to pursue these goals and we're going to do it as one, which I think is better because I think it brings everyone together around the same table a little bit more than having separate organizations. But I don't know, only time will tell.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason we settled on Academy, right, instead of Society, because we really wanted it to carry a little bit more gravitas. And AVE is also just kind of nice and short, and it's a good acronym. But yeah, and Eric was really in part of that process of standing up because when we entered into the MOU with AAVMC, your committee was already pretty much in the throes of developing a constitution and bylaws. And then they came back and said we didn't need those. But now I'm glad that you guys did that. So I don't know if you want to speak to that at all or.
Yeah, that was the conversations that we were having on that committee, is like, how do we want to organize this? And, what do we want to call things? And at the end of the day, we really did use our existing specialty college organizational documents as a template, because that's what we want to be doing here. Obviously we want to be supporting and encouraging veterinary educators, but that credentialing piece, I feel, was like that was the initiating thought for that the council group that you got together, and that was really the motivation for putting AVE together. And so I definitely wanted to kind of maintain that.
I
Yeah.
think it's important to remember too, having a society, an academy, having a group of people, right? A community of people who have a common goal is not just like, let's get together and have fun and like get to know each other. That's awesome, do that. But we're trying to elevate the quality of what we're talking about, right? And so by having a credentialing, like that's one of the ways that you can try to ensure that that's going to happen, right? So not just say we're going to get together and we're going to chat, but we're going to come together to say, what are the things that people should be doing? How do we provide guidance for people to elevate their own practice, elevate their own educational skills? Like that's what people are seeking, right? Like if you decide I want to go on and do a specialty in anything, you're saying, okay, but I'm going to look to a group who can help me figure out what that means and how do I accomplish it. And so I do think it's really important to have that offering to people. But I think, like you said, Eric, you can do both. We can be inclusive and welcoming and encouraging to lots of people, but also simultaneously, this is how we raise the bar. This is how we move things forward. So I mean, I think I can understand why there'd be hesitation and resistance, and things are hard, but just because something's hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And so yeah, I think it's great.
And I always think about there's a pretty famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in it he explains, why, like, the process that happens, and like there's always pushback, and this is how paradigms shift. And so that's what I think of all the time when I'm hearing pushback. I'm like, oh, this is just like how this rolls. This is part of the process.
For those of you who would like to read that book, that's Thomas S. Kuhn, Kuhn. It's phenomenal. You should read it. Everybody should read it. Yeah,
I have to say, I did struggle. It's very thin. It's not a lengthy book. It is not accessible language wise.
No, it's pretty high level, but it's still, I mean, I think most people, at least in our circles, I think could probably get through it. But I think, I think more importantly for me too was, yes, the credentialing was important, but I think even more so was this idea that education is a discipline. Education has research, it has evidence-informed practice, and that may change and it may flux a little bit. That's why I don't use the term best practice in education, because what may be best practice for anesthesia may not be best practice for, emergency and critical care, which may not be best practice for cardiology. There are good practices and there are evidence-informed practices. But the other thing is that the literature is unequivocal in the single biggest influence in the quality of learning that happens in a classroom is the quality of teaching that occurs at the front of the classroom or within that classroom. And it doesn't matter whether you're a veterinarian or a veterinary technician or an English professor or a geology professor, it's the quality of teaching. So this idea that if you have the content down, that somehow magically you're imbued with the skills to actually give the information in a way that's accessible to the students who need it is completely debunked in the research. It's completely false. And it doesn't mean that content knowledge isn't important. It is very important. It just means that there's another piece of that pie that's missing. And I think for me, that was also important. And that was an also important part of elevating veterinary education, right? With like getting more people to recognize that education is a discipline and that you need to have some training in it. And that just because you went to vet school and then you got a specialty doesn't mean that you're able to practice. So I use this analogy a lot because I'm actually contributing to Micah's book that's coming out on clinical education. And, I talk about theory in the first section, and I talk about how one of the things that's really important about, teaching practice is to reflect on why you teach the way you teach. Like, why do you teach the way you teach? And if your answer is, I teach this way because of the way I was taught, that's the wrong answer, right? And so I say, I mean, I feel pretty confident that if you walked into your physician's office for an appointment and, you had a conversation and it came up and you're like, oh, well, where did you go to medical school? And the physician looked at you and said, oh, I didn't go to medical school, but I've been a patient my entire life. And that's how I learned to be a doctor. Like, you would get up and walk out, right? But that's what we do with education every single day. Well, I have never really gotten any training in education, but I've been a student my whole life, so I know how to teach. And that's also part, I think, of what AVE is to me, is like helping people understand there's more to education than like how we generally view it. And That's not just veterinary medicine. That's like the United
Sure.
States.
Yeah. Well, it's true for education. It's very, that's similar to like the epiphany I had years ago where, everybody's talking about evidence-based medicine, and that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, but it's like, what if we applied those same standards to how we're teaching? And, maybe we could say why, again, exactly what you said, Catherine, like, why are we teaching this way? Well, sometimes in medicine we don't have evidence, and then we do the best we can with the modeling that we've seen and our experience, and that's fine. But when there is evidence, maybe we should use that. But here's the funny thing, like even in medicine, like we're not always very good at that. So, as human beings, we really like what's familiar and what's comfortable. But this is where, again, getting people together and creating some standards, not for how to teach, but how do you improve teaching? Not like you said, not the details of what are quote unquote best practices or not, but hey, let's make you aware that there is evidence for a lot of this, and hey, this is a thing that, like you said, this is a discipline. And so for the people who are like, what do you mean I already got boarded in this and I have to get boarded in something else? Well, you know what, if you were boarded in anesthesia and then suddenly wanted to be a surgeon, it wouldn't be ridiculous to say, yeah, if you want to be doing certain types of surgeries, or if you want to elevate the surgeries you can do, that might be a reasonable thing to expect. So does that mean that anybody who teaches ever has to have no? That's not what that means. But if you want to call your, like, this is education is what I do and who I am, maybe that's a reasonable expectation.
I could probably do a cat neuter without any significant challenge.
But maybe not a cholecystectomy,
Probably not a cholecystectomy, exactly. Yeah. Well, it makes me think of one of the motivations for this podcast for Rive is Key Lime podcast, which is about medical education. And they do spend some time talking about discipline versus field, like where are we in this? And there is certainly philosophical arguments to be made one way or the other. But I think that what I kind of come back to is that there is evidence about veterinary education that is different from even medical education, and the context is different, and our students are different. And so I do believe that there is knowledge that is general education applicable, right? But then I think that there are things about veterinary medical education that are unique.
Yeah, agreed. And I also think part of that is, like, we all had to learn the language of medicine, right? We all, when we went to vet school, had to learn the language of medicine. And if you went and specialized in emergency or critical care, you had some additional, more advanced language that you had to learn, or anesthesia, more advanced language that you had to learn. So many people bandy about educational language that is so inaccurate and so incorrect, and that is also really frustrating.
Oh, you've got a great example. I can't remember it right now.
Didactic, right? So
yes,
everybody I know in the world talks about didactic teaching versus clinical teaching, and I'm like, okay, because I'm a word nerd, right? So like I look up the etymology of didactic and I look up the definition, and I'm like, I just want to know if this is actually being used correctly. And no, it's not. Didactic means intended to teach. So everything we do in veterinary education is didactic, right? And so, yeah, it's just things like that. And I think one of the challenges is getting people to understand, like, we're not all theoretical people. I get that. I'm not a huge, like, I don't sit and theorize things and just think about new ways to think about things. But there are some basic theories in education that if you understand them, and then you think about your teaching in the context of those, you might realize one of two things. One is your theoretical stance and what you do in the classroom line up really well. And that's great, right? That's the ideal situation. But if you have discomfort in teaching, or you feel like you're not good at teaching, it might be because you're teaching in a way that doesn't align with your actual theoretical stance. And this happens a lot, particularly for positivists, behaviorists, right? People who are like, I'm a sit and get kind of person. These people need to teach this way, but, oh, I'm in a curriculum where everybody wants me to do this touchy-feely PBL and engage students and, active learning. And that can cause some real dissonance, and it can cause some real frustration on the parts of the students and the faculty. So, I mean, even just basic things like understanding the language and understanding why maybe you're frustrated in the classroom isn't necessarily because you're not good at what you do, but because you're trying to do, you're trying to pound a square peg into a round hole, right? Like, and that's the same thing that's such a
good point. I remember a talk in my master's, and they were like, these are all the things that influence this environment. So you have your curriculum, you have your students, you have your physical context, your environment, you have your content knowledge, you have your pedagogical content knowledge. Like you have all of this interplay of stuff. And I remember taking those notes, and I kept them for many years because I'm like, this is a good list and we all should know this list. And I did not know this list. And I was teaching students for like 15 years
Yeah.
before I got this list, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, right? Like, we're not going to make perfect teachers. That's not the goal. And we're not even going to necessarily make that first year teacher great at what they do the first year, but they're going to be a heck of a lot better than they would have been if they walked in without any of that information. And so, I think that's important. And I think in this day and age too, that it's a social science, education is a social science. So, that's the other part of that, is the educational research, right? People understanding that educational research is not the same as biomedical science research or clinical research. There's like no RCT and, in education. It's for very many reasons, but just helping them understand that too. So there's so many unique things about education as a whole, and then veterinary education specifically, that that I think AVE is really poised to kind of help elucidate for a lot of people.
Think about it just very practically from an efficiency standpoint, right? Like, so kind of like what Eric is saying, like, okay, for 15 years, I've been doing it this way. And sometimes I have, over 15 years of trial and error, I have started to do things a better way, that I later found out is actually, oh, there's some theoretical reason, or there's some empirical evidence to actually support why this is working. But maybe I didn't need to take 15 years of trial and error to figure that out. Like, why would, like, that's not, kind of to your comment before, Catherine, like, that's not how I'm practicing medicine. I go, actually, there's this body of knowledge about how to do this well, and we're going to give you that foundation. And that's not everything, and it's not going to work every time, and you're going to have to keep learning on your own. But boy, we could give you a big head start, if we just kind of, and I think we can do that same thing with education. Yes, you have a lot of content expertise in veterinary medicine, but you don't have to just do this and struggle for 15 years plus, to maybe stumble across something that works better. We can actually just help you get there way faster. Is it going to be perfect? No. Is it going to be instantaneous? No, but it's probably going to be faster than a couple of decades, which is what it's realistically taking. And that's for someone like Eric and I, who we're always trying to improve our teaching. And if you're not making that effort, it's going to take even longer, and maybe you'll never get there. But that's one of the things that I find, in my master's training, is I'm like, yeah, I do it that way now, but man, it would have been great to have learned this, 15, 20 years ago. And I wouldn't have had to, now I don't like look up all my old students and send them thank you, or, apology notes, kind of a thing.
Right, exactly.
Thanks for letting me experiment.
I mean, if you're teaching an average of 100, just conservatively, an average of 100 students a year for 15 years, I mean, that's like 1,500 students that you may potentially have. I mean, you probably didn't screw them up, but you could have made it a lot better, right?
Yeah, some of them were not having a good time. Some of them were not. But that's still true now. Even knowing what I know, like, some of you are not going to jive with me.
There are fewer of them now. I feel confident about that.
I also think that understanding education as a discipline helps when it comes to things like student evaluations, right? Like, so I was having a conversation when I was teaching public health with a psychologist who taught, and I think he was actually maybe a psychiatrist, but he taught in the medical school, and we were having a conversation about student evaluations, which was pretty much the only way anybody got promoted at that particular institution if you weren't on the tenure track. And he was like, but I hear what you're saying to me about this and this and this, but aren't you worried about your student evaluations? And I just looked at him and I said, no. And he's like, but I'm like, listen, sometimes you're going to do something and it doesn't turn out the way you want it to. And sometimes you're going to do something and it's all right, and the students still aren't going to like you. I said, the problem is that we're relying on student evaluations to get promoted, right? Like, the problem is not that I'm doing something different in the classroom. And if you go into the classroom worried about whether students are going to like you, then you're probably never going to be the educator that you could potentially be. It doesn't mean that you should like
ignore that completely.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, of course you want students to engage with you, but I'm fond of saying sometimes we have to give students what they need, not what they want. And sometimes you do something and it's like a total failure, and you're like, ooh. I mean, it's not that you didn't get what you needed, but I definitely could do that better. So that's the way
we'll put in the show notes the episode where we read student evaluations.
Yeah. I was
Oh,
thinking that
yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Something that you said, Catherine, that I kind of wanted to go back to is the intersection of biomedical science and social science. And I see on the biomedical science side where people are like, why don't you have randomized trials of this? Like you
Mhm.
said, I'm also noticing on the social science side, some of the critiques of having a credential process that we've encountered are, well, oh, it's so individualized. Like my personal path is so unique that you couldn't possibly test
Right.
general educational knowledge, which I think is very much a social science perspective. I don't know if both of you honestly want to speak to that.
I think it can be. And I mean, to be honest with you, education for a long time really wanted to be a quote unquote hard science, right? Like it was all about quantitative research. It was all about the numbers. It was all about trial and error and interventions and treatments. Um, and so I think education is finally realizing that it is actually a social science and that, you have to have sort of those stories as well. Um, I personally think that that's kind of a cop out to say that my life is so unique and different that, I mean, because I'm one of those, like, I'm a qualitative researcher through and through, but that doesn't mean I discount the value added of having quantitative research, right? Like, you have to have both to get the full picture, I think. And I think people who are social scientists that have that attitude are probably not as open to the idea that quantitative research is really important and maybe are a little insecure about what they do or how they go about it because yeah, I mean we all have unique experiences, but in the end we all sort of generally can be
Yeah.
quantified
I
in
would
ways.
also push back on the idea that just because something is qualitative in nature doesn't mean it can't be evaluated, right? Like we
Oh,
can't,
sure. Yeah,
that's it for quality, right? And so the whole
yeah.
idea of a credentialing process, if done well, right, in a situation like this, would be very inclusive to lots of different
Right.
paths and processes, and it wouldn't all have to look the same. But that doesn't mean that your particular path can't be, evaluated for quality, right?
Right. And nor would it look the same. Like your
Exactly.
portfolio is not going to look the same as my portfolio, is not
Yeah.
going to look the same as Eric's portfolio, but at some level, they're all going to meet a certain quality standard based on a rubric that's provided by the people who are going to be reviewing those portfolios.
And
So
that
yeah,
doesn't mean that, the original rubric we'll find out later, somebody submits a thing, you go, wow, that doesn't really fit into our rubric. And so we're going to have to expand and we're going to have to think about that. But I think just because something is unique doesn't mean it couldn't possibly be, evaluated for quality.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if that were the case, then we would have to do like 7 billion studies every time we did anything because
Or just give up completely, which is sort
right,
of
yeah,
antithetical to why we're even talking about this right now. Like
right.
the whole point is we want to improve things, and being open to new ideas is part of that, right? Like innovation is a big part of it, but also you can't just be like, well, just because something is new doesn't mean it's good,
Right.
and doesn't mean that it should be replicated or it should be revered. But it does I think brings up a fair point, is that we have to be mindful that sometimes when things are new and people don't know how to evaluate it, there are challenges with that. But I think, as Catherine said, I would agree. That sounds a little bit like a cop out from somebody to say like, well, mine is just so new, unique, nobody could possibly understand. I was like, well, then maybe help us understand. And if
Right.
you can't, then I'm not
Yeah.
sure, you've got a very solid argument there. So
I
yeah.
think the biggest objection is to an exam, like a thing that you could give to people that's like, this is a right answer to a
Yeah.
Right.
multiple choice question, for example. But to Catherine's point about like the language of education, I should be able to ask a definitional question in a multiple choice exam and expect, if you are going to call yourself an expert in veterinary education, that you can provide a right answer to that,
Yeah.
as an example.
There is a correct answer to what behaviorism is. There is
Yes.
a correct answer to what cognitivism is. There is
Yeah.
a correct answer to what
Yeah.
constructivism is. It may be a little wishy-washy in how
Sure.
you want to write it, but behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism are completely different theoretical stances, right?
And
So
so yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a certain level of knowledge that if you know, I think it's reasonable to expect in order for us to have a conversation about these kinds of things, like you need to have some of that foundational knowledge. So, but if it was entirely reliant on an exam like that, then I would agree with those people to say maybe that's not capturing everything that we're looking for.
Absolutely.
But say that's a portion of it, and maybe that's one piece of your entire portfolio, is that yes, you can demonstrate that you have working knowledge of, you know, these major theories in education. And so I think that's a really fair point, Eric.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are some very basic things like you should know the difference between formative and a summative assessment. You know?
Oh yeah. That's it. But a great example. Yeah. And there's also, I think, there are, to the biochemical, bio research perspective, there are things that we have established in education over decades through multiple well-conducted randomized mass controlled trials, right? Like that evidence is not absent in education. It's just not the gold standard that it is in biomedical research. So when we have answers to objective reality, we should know those. Like that should be walk around knowledge for us.
Well, and from a very practical standpoint, when we're talking about the language of education, one thing that I have learned is that a lot more of it becomes accessible when you know the language. If I want to read up about something and I don't know what term it's called, it's impossible to find it in the literature, right? Like it's not impossible. It's really, really hard. It takes a lot of digging through random things you find on Google to be like, oh, that's the term they use. And then suddenly you search for that and a bajillion things come up. And so if you are going to reach a certain standard, a certain, level of expertise in education, you should know what these terms are and that you can find the evidence more easily and more efficiently. Like they're just, if I were talking to an anesthesiologist and I mentioned isoflurane and they were like, what? And their reason was they only use sevoflurane. That's not acceptable, And so, that's the best I could come up with on the top of my head. But again, you don't have to be an expert.
But you're exactly right. Like I have never anesthetized a fish, but I know how, right? I read that chapter in Lemon Jones with a little bit of time. If you gave me a fish, I could anesthetize it. You could ask me multiple choice questions about how to anesthetize a fish, right? Like as an expert, this is walk around knowledge for me.
Yeah.
And I always love when he uses that example because I have actually anesthetized a fish. And so I have actually done something in anesthesia that an anesthesiologist has not done.
But did you anesthetize the water? Is that how you did it? Did you add the drugs to the water?
Yeah, you add the drugs to the water.
That's the extent of what I remember.
That's it. You add the drugs to the water. That's pretty much all you do. So
that's awesome.
Have you anesthetized a turtle? That's the question.
And how did you know that you would?
Yeah, exactly. How do you know when you start cutting on them and they move around? You know that they're still anesthetized.
Nope, you missed it again.
Yeah. So and I do think that having that language allows you to also support what you're doing, right? So like if a student questions you or if somebody questions you about it, you can say, well, I understand that maybe this doesn't seem right to you, but this is why I do the things that I do. Like when I was teaching public health, my classroom was always the loudest classroom in the hall. And people would come by and they're like, how do you know what's going on? It's like chaos and there's anything going on. I'm like, listen, I'm a constructivist. This is what I do. Like students need to engage in active learning so that they can create new knowledge based on, what they're doing and compare that to and they're like, oh, okay. And they're walking on and it's like, but I can justify it comfortably because I can tell people this is like legitimate. I'm not just letting people run around crazy doing things. There's a purpose behind what I'm doing.
But similarly, and actually, I decide I don't want to be a constructivist. I need to understand constructivism to know how to say that's not my jam.
Yeah.
Well, but so that's actually a really good example of a multiple choice question where you could say, okay, here's your scenario, just like you do when you write a good multiple choice question for a clinically oriented class, right? When I write a question about cardiology, I give them a case scenario. And then I'm like, which of these is most appropriate? So like you are a constructivist teaching public health, and like you set it up like that. And I believe an expert in education should be able to review that, understand what that is being communicated, and then choose the right answer.
Yeah. They should also be able to write a good multiple choice question, but that's a whole other
No, but absolutely, absolutely. But that's another great example. You know, like
Yeah,
we
there's some
should be able to
practical.
write a multiple choice question, like which of these is a well-constructed um
Yeah,
God.
STEM,
Them, yeah.
Yeah, well-constructed stem or well-constructed
distractor or something.
distractor. Thank you. That was the word, ironically, as we're talking about terminology that I couldn't get. But yeah, right. Like yeah,
Well, because
I
the
don't know,
other
like
thing is,
the people who object to like
yeah,
we can't have multiple choice questions that ask people this because the path to being an educator is so specialized. I'm like,
but
I
here's
mean,
the
then you're not an
thing.
expert. Then you're not an
Well,
expert.
but also we're not talking about education at large. We're talking about veterinary medical education.
Yeah.
And in that, again, we've been talking about what's unique to here. Well, guess what? All of our students for the foreseeable future are going to have to be able to take multiple choice question or multiple choice exams and when it comes to the NAVLE. And so, yes, I do expect you to be an expert. And as Catherine said, you should be able to write a good quality multiple choice question, and you should be able to interpret the metrics of the results of said test. Like these are all things that in veterinary medical education. So if you want to be, if you want to choose a different discipline in education and do that, that's fine. But that's not what AVE is talking about.
Right.
We're talking about veterinary education. And so there are certain things that I think we can say, this is expected of somebody to be an accomplished veterinary educator.
Yes.
These are some things you want to do. Maybe that argument would fly if it wasn't veterinary education and you were going to go and do, only ethnography in, Northern Africa and for whatever, come up with some very narrow field. You say this couldn't possibly apply. Okay, but that isn't what we're doing here.
Right.
So yeah, anyway.
So that actually reminds me, this is like totally off topic, but I'm doing a feedback research study with a couple of colleagues. And one of the questions, so we're doing a qualitative research study because it's like way too much data. But one of the questions was basically, how open are you to receiving feedback, right? And so we asked faculty and students to sort of answer these open-ended questions. And one faculty member, obviously they're de-identified, but one faculty member was like, well, I consider myself very open to, appropriate feedback. But there are some things when students tell me, I'm just not going to do it. Like, for example, I repeatedly have students ask me to write learning objectives, but I just don't think that's reasonable. They just need to figure out what's important. And we're just like,
but I'm super open to feedback.
But I'm super open to feedback, right?
The importance of qualitative evidence.
But there's another great STEM for a multiple choice question. Like, which of these would hit the create level of Bloom's taxonomy for a learning objective, right?
Yeah.
So Bobby, to your point, like, yeah, could you be like an ethnographer off nowhere? And I'm like, okay, yeah. So like, if all you do is high quality spay neuter anesthesia and like that's your jam, and you know those drugs and you're like an expert, you like all of my random source animals survive, it's like, great, are you an expert in anesthesia? Right. Here's a horse, go.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And again, according to the standards of the American College of Veterinary Anesthesiologists, you don't pass if you can't do these other things, because again, you can argue and say that's not fair, I should be, treated as the same, but that's not what we have here. And that's not the expectations that have been set up. And so, yeah, having an academy and having credentials, does that create some barriers for some sort of okay, but that's not preventing you from doing the thing you want to do. The goal is not necessarily to say everybody must do this and must conform, but what it says is it communicates a certain expectation. And so if you say you are a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Anesthesiologists, I have an expectation that if I ask you about equine anesthesia, that you can give me an answer. Or if I ask you to perform that, you can do that. Yeah. And so that's really all we're trying to do is communicate to others in the field and to the general public that this is what this means. And you can choose whether or not you want to be part of it. That doesn't prevent you from doing the things.
Yeah, I also think part of it for me is this idea that, and I've been trying to, my brain is not functioning fully tonight. I apologize. I got vaccinated yesterday and I'm living on vitamin I. So going back to the whole multiple choice question thing, right? Like veterinary students are required to take a pretty high stakes multiple choice test at the end of it all, right? It's called the NAVLE. And one thing I hope will eventually happen, and this may not happen in our lifetime, but there's going to be a realization with more people understanding education that, going back to that theory conversation, right? Like what we are doing to our students in the classroom is confusing to them. because we are asking them to pay attention to the process, to pay attention to, clinical reasoning and kind of going from A to Z and explaining why they get there. And if they get from A to J and then they skip K and L, figuring out where they skipped that. But the answer is not going from A to Z to get to Z. It's to go through the process of getting to Z. And what we do when we ask them multiple choice questions is ask them to go straight to Z and get the correct answer. And so, like, this actually creates cognitive dissonance for students, because you're telling me that you want me to learn how to reason through these problems, but when it comes to my exams, you're asking me to just get the right answer, right? And so if we can help elevate education in a way that people realize that what we're doing to our students is also not always appropriate. There are places where that's appropriate, right? Like in anatomy, sometimes that has to be multiple choice. There is a correct answer and there's an incorrect answer. And that doesn't mean that some multiple choice questions don't have a best answer and a least best answer. But when we say to our students repeatedly throughout the time in their program, we just want you to work on the processes. We want you to go through the reasoning processes. But then we tell them that really it's the outcome that's important. That's really confusing. And a lot of students maybe no students would be able to really tell you that or articulate that about why they're confused, but that's confusing, right? Like, I'm going to tell you all of these life cycles of all these parasites, and they're really important because of X, Y, and Z, and you need to understand them and blah, 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 blah. But really in the end, I'm just going to ask you
what
the Latin name of that particular thing is, right? I mean, it's a very strange thing. So if we can get more people understanding that that's not.
Well, you know me, I love my short answer and open-ended question exams.
I mean,
the trick is
choice,
getting people to grade those darn things.
Yeah, I mean, they're efficient and I get it. And there's definitely a place for them. But I also would hope someday, and I've talked to some people who are at ICBA who are like, well, I'm not really sure about the NAVLE, right? Like, it's a great test, but is it actually doing what we want it to do?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's I think for me, it's kind of an okay thing, because hopefully at the individual vet schools, right, some more of that other piece is happening, and this is one piece that you need to complete successfully to become a qualified veterinarian. And again, but the more people that get involved with things like AVE, and we can start to see rising of the bar when it comes to expectations for veterinary education. Those kinds of things become like real possibilities to say, hey, we might need to overhaul the system that we use to assess whether our students can do what we want them to do, and maybe a multiple choice test alone is not the entirety of what that should be. But we only have a few more minutes, but I want to give you all a chance. I would love to hear, like, where are things now? What's happening with AVE right now?
Oh, I'm gonna let Eric answer that one.
Well, so this episode will drop January, February, or something like that. So by the time anyone listens to it, the AAVMC and AVE will be separated, and AVE is trying to establish itself as a 501c3 organization and is doing its thing, which is what we kind of set out with in the beginning. So a number of people that I've talked to have kind of breathed a sigh of relief, to be honest, not being associated with AAVMC. Not that they were bad, but that just being able to plot your own course is different, Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say, like, we'll be grateful for the support they gave at the very beginning. And again, getting the infrastructure, I think that was really, really crucial for getting things started. And that's okay. It's kind of like, if you're like a parent or a teacher or a trainer and you go, hey, I've helped you get to this point, and now go off and do your own thing. Great job, little ones. Like, there's nothing, I don't think there has to be anything bad about, the separation. That's a sign of growth. And I think that can be a good thing. So,
well, I mean, ultimately, and Eric knows this, that the thought was that we probably wouldn't have stayed connected with them beyond that original MOU anyway. It happened a little sooner than we anticipated, the separation, but I also think in the end, as frustrating as the process and the way it happened was, in the end, it's a really good thing for AVE.
But I remember when this all started, that I think that was part of the original conversations, was that, hey, AVE, like, this doesn't have to be it forever, but it was like, hey, while we're getting started, I remember those conversations, or those statements being made at the time, like, hey, we're going to start this way. That doesn't mean it's going to stay like this forever. This is just a way to help kind of provide a little support at the beginning. So I don't think it's a terrible thing.
No.
I appreciate you guys somewhat indulging me, but this was on our list, and who knows? Maybe in 5 years we'll look back on this recording and be like, "Oh, that is not how I remember it." But we'll see.
Yeah, yeah,
Very
exactly.
possible.
That's
It's so
super
funny you
possible.
say that, because I will tell stories about my childhood, and after about it, I mean, I'm not very smart. So after about 5 years of telling some of the same stories, I was like, I feel like I'm either 8 or 12 in every single story that I tell. And it's not possible that all of those things happened when I was either 8 or 12 years old.
So funny.
So
Well, thanks for everything that you both did for getting AVE off the ground and keeping it going and maintaining things. So for one of those 700 people who is a member, and counting, we appreciate having a place to sort of call home and to place to network with others. And so, yeah, thanks for all the work you've all done to get us here.
thanks for being a member. Hopefully we'll keep doing great things. We always knew it was going to be a long haul. We never
Hopefully.
thought it was
the
going to
idea.
happen in a couple of years. So I think it's a good thing.
Great.
Great.
Well, we'll catch you all next time.